So let's think about, as we breathe, air comes into our nose, right? Passes in our nostrils through that little vestibule, the nasal vestibule, gets into the nasal cavity, but goes through the three meatuses, swirls around, warms, moistens, get filtered, goes back through the posterior nasal aperture into the nasopharynx, down to the oropharynx, down to the laryngopharynx, and goes forward into the voice box, down past the vocal cords in the glottis, down to the trachea, C-rings, carina, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quintary. What do you say next?
I don't know what you're speaking.
It's going fast. All those branches. How many? 16 and then 7. Well, here's the last 3. Okay. So the point is, all those things, all those tubes I just mentioned, there is no gas exchange there. See, your nose doesn't live because oxygen soaks through the membrane. The oxygen has to go all the way in deep into the lungs to those little alveoli before it gets into the blood and can make your nose live. And before it gets in the blood and can make your nasal cavity live, and your oral cavity, and your throat. So it's very important to understand we have basically 2 major zones in your system. The tubes that just carry the air, and then only right at the end that I'm about to mark up and show you, wherever we have these little circular structures called alveoli, that's the only place in the human body we get gas exchange. That's it. So we can say we divide this, I'm going to go right here, into 2 zones. Over here on this side, we're going to call it the and that's because, yeah, you guys got it, gas exchange. Everything before that, which we're not really seeing except for one little baby tube here, and everything else is the, you can call it conducting or conduction. I'm okay with either. So, and it just moves air from the nose all the way to those tubes that I'm about to name for you, called the terminal bronchioles. Okay. And so on this picture, here's what we're going to learn. Because on the lung, we learned the first 3 branches were primary bronchi, secondary, and tertiary bronchi. And now we're going to get to the very end, after all the 16 generations, and they get some bronchioles, and they get the little stuff. We're going to go backward to learn these. So first, I'm going to, can you guys see okay if I leave the light like this? Can you see the board good enough? Okay. First off, alveoli, A-L-V-E-O-L-I. That is plural for each of these little circles. They kind of look like a marshmallow, right? Kind of resemble like when we saw histology in fat cells, because they were little hollow white cells. They're not fat cells, by the way. Okay, I'm just saying that. Do you remember from AMP1 that these little air sacs are one layer of flat cells? What's that epithelium called?
Simple squamous.
Simple squamous. You'll see it on the next slide, so I don't need to write it here because we'll see it in a minute. But yeah, these little sacs are simple squamous. They're only one layer thick, and they're covered with blood vessels, capillaries, so the air leaves them and goes right into the blood. We'll see that in the next picture too. What we're seeing here is how they cluster together in little groups called alveolar sacs. And notice they spell sac, S-A-C. That's not how we spell sac most of the time, but that's my mom's initials, so I always liked sac spelled like that. All right, so there's an alveolar sac. Hey, what's this whole thing called? Alveolar sac. That's probably not on the test. Sorry. Alveoli, good chance alveoli is going to be there. The individual ones are more important to me to understand what they are, but they do cluster in these sacs. So every one of those sacs has their own little tube in it. This one would be right here, but we don't really see it. This one we kind of see coming in here like that. Oh, look, they labeled it. Can you read that label? Very good. Alveolar duct. So there we go. Each of these sacs has a tube in it called an alveolar duct. That is the last branch of all of the tubes. Primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary, sexary, heptary, octary, nonary, decary, deca. Keep going, right? All through all those. That's why I took Latin in high school. So that's how they count in science. It's silly. All those 23, the last of the 23 is called alveolar duct, and it terminates in sacs of alveoli. That's where most of your gas exchange takes place. Okay. Isn't that crazy though? We breathe it in right here, and it's got to go all the way through the whole system and permeate deep into the lungs. By the way, the pictures always show them over here. Please don't be fooled. Your alveoli aren't just there. They're throughout the lungs. Some tubes turn this way, some turn this way, some turn that way, some turn that way. They're everywhere. But it's just hard for us to draw it and show all that. Then we have a few little tubes right here that have just a couple of alveoli on them. So they're like, okay, those aren't ducts going up into the sac. That is like a tube that's mostly naked but has a few little alveoli on it. So it does participate in gas exchange, which we could call respiration. So what would be a good name for the bronchioles that respire? Oh, respiratory bronchioles. So those are the next to the last tubes. The last tubes are alveolar ducts. The ones right before them that have just a couple of alveoli on them are respiratory bronchioles. And that is it for the respiratory zone now. That's the respiratory zone. 2 tubes, alveoli, sacs. That's it. All the other stuff is the conduction zone, just conducting the air. Warming, moistening it, filtering it, and getting it to this point so we can get it in the blood. Imagine if you blocked a terminal bronchiole. No air down to any of those. No gas exchange. Well, that'd be bad. That could be bad. Okay, so what is a terminal bronchiole? It's the terminal means last. It's the last bronchiole. There's more than one way to say this, but it's the last bronchiole that just conducts the air. Or we could say that only conducts air. It's the last one that just conducts the air. After that, they're conducting it plus they're exchanging it. And so that's this picture. That's it. By the way, respiratory zone and conduction zone, not really on your lab test. Those are lecture topics. But labeling this picture is on the lab test. Specifically, either terminal or respiratory bronchiole, alveolar duct, or probably alveoli. Those are the 4 big things I like to have labeled on this. Especially difference between terminal bronchiole and respiratory. It's if it has an alveoli on it or if it doesn't. Okay. Okay, so here we saw a picture of the trachea. Now it's time to see a lung. Actually, let me go back to this first. Their picture, I'll just admit it, their picture's better than mine. They finally did it. It have a picture better than us. Except, here's the problem. Their picture has so much more. See everything that looks like little tiny things? Those are the alveoli. Wow, all these little alveoli. And they look great. But also they think we should be able to go, oh, that's a respiratory bronchiole and there's the alveolar duct. Are you kidding me? So we took our own picture, but we didn't have a lung that was so well put together that we could like get that. And at the time we didn't think of screen capturing it because back then the resolution on screen captures wasn't good and you blow it up and it's all. So we took our own picture and it wasn't as good, but here it is. And I say it wasn't as good for a couple reasons. Because those poor little alveoli just didn't stay together. They just spread out so much. So when you see this, look, here's my favorite. Call that an alveoli right there. When you get this picture, the important thing to know, well, there's only three things. This is a lung. The tissue, tell me the tissue type. Simple squamous epithelium. There it is everywhere. To me, this resembles a chain necklace that you just set down on the dresser and it just kind of coils up. I always thought it looked like that. And we might name structures called alveoli, like right there. Or, look, I'll do a few of them in black for you. They're not perfect, but they're kind of like that. Those are the alveoli. They've just been a little messed up on this slide. When they cut them, they moved them too much. It didn't hold its shape. So that's your, so now we already have all the slides for respiratory. We separated it into three pictures, but it was just two organs. It was a trachea and a lung. Remember, it's the question that tells you what to put. If it's tissue, it's simple squamous. If it's a structure, it's alveoli. If it's the organ, it's the lung. That's the beauty of some things, especially when there's not much on one. If you start understanding the language that we use, like what are structures, what are tissues, and what are organs, you really don't have to know what it's even pointing at on this slide. Okay, this picture, I'll just tell you it won't be on the test. This is to help you understand how these alveolar ducts function with the little sac. So there's the duct coming through here. We don't see it. Here's the little sac. There's the little alveoli. Notice the picture we had before didn't show you this, but there are tons of capillaries. Those are the red ones on every alveolus. It's surrounded. In fact, it makes them look like soccer balls or volleyballs, right? The pattern, it's cool. Also, what we didn't tell you before is there are elastic fibers that follow around them. So breathe in, alveoli expand. Breathe out, just like the pulse. The elastic fibers recoil, they snap back. So they get stretched and they snap back, and that pushes the air out. So in lecture, you'll hear this. Breathing in is active. We contract the diaphragm to breathe in. If you just relax, elastic recoil pushes the air out. So it's passive. So normal breathing, like you guys now just chill in class, breathe in real light, active breathing in, passive breathing out. Active, passive. When you exercise, it's different. When you exercise, we're using muscles to push air out too. Okay, here's a real picture with alveoli and all the capillaries on their surface. So many. The only, I think it's cool, the only place you get gas exchange is where there's a capillary on the surface of the alveoli, because it's underneath where the alveoli pushes it up into this capillary. So these empty spaces, no gas exchange. It's only where the capillaries are where you would get gas exchange. And so the next picture, I'll show you that. That's what I'm going to use the next picture for. If you want this because you just want to have it, you can. But remember, this is not on the test. However, maybe it helps you for lecture because elastic fibers remind you that when you breathe out, it's passive. They just recoil. Okay. So can you, in this picture, here's one alveoli. Let me use the, there's one. Here's another one over here. Here's another one up there. So this is, we're looking at a little cluster of alveoli. We're going to focus on that center one though. Notice how the cells look like little fried eggs because they're squamous cells when you see them from the top. That's how they look. Here is where one capillary is. And here's another one. And here's another. And another little bit. So only around there can this alveolus gas exchange. Can move the gas. Hey, what gas is in here that we breathed in from the air that we need to get in the blood? Yeah, O2 or oxygen. We need to do that with it. And what's in the blood that the tissues made that we need to breathe out? Carbon dioxide. So look what they're going to do. They're going to show us by using this picture right here. They're going to blow it up and show us. Here's the alveoli membrane. Oh my goodness, look how thin that is. Here's a capillary with a red blood cell. There's how thin its membrane is. Because it's simple squamous. So I'm going to use a little blue pen to show you the thickness of the alveolus. So thin. A little red pen to show us the thickness of the capillary. Its little membrane right there. And then it's across there that they gas exchange. Right across there. So what's in between them? What's this little here? Close. I'm going to use a different word. Whenever we have epithelium, at the bottom of it where it's stuck, we call it a basement membrane. Since these are two epitheliums, they're stuck together by, watch this, they fuse their basement membranes. So, fancy time. They call this, where we get gas exchange, a respiratory membrane. That definitely sounds like lecture to me. Right? And a respiratory membrane where you get gas exchange consists of three things. The simple squamous epithelium of the alveolus, the simple squamous epithelium of the capillary, and their shared or fused basement membranes. Notice they don't say simple squamous. They just say alveolar epithelium, capillary, endothelium, that's just its simple squamous, and the fused basement membranes of both. How thin do you think that would be? A simple squamous cell, and a little basement membrane that's almost invisible too. That's pretty thin. So oxygen moves well. Carbon dioxide moves well across that. Imagine someone has a lung disease and they get what's called fibrosis or excessive connective tissue in there. The basement membrane gets thicker and thicker. Anything that thickens any of those layers, gas won't move as well. So many lung diseases thicken the respiratory membrane. Or some lung diseases, mucus gets in the alveoli and mucus sits on this side. And now that's a barrier that air has to go through the mucus and it can't get through the mucus. So that's a really important thing. So I think I like to do this in stages. I like to get you guys to take a picture of this, that all we did was deal with the respiratory membrane. And then I'm going to go back and tell you a little about the two types of cells of the alveoli and the fact that there's macrophages in there. Cool, go like this. So these normal cells that look like little fried eggs, those, they just happen to call them type 1 cells. They're alveolar cells, so they're the alveolus. They call them type 1. They're just forming the alveolus, that's it. They're just normal squamous cells. But these funny guys, no, they're not green in the real body. But they're in there and they're secretors. They're secreting a chemical. And there's the name of the chemical. It's called surfactant. Anybody hear of surfactant before? That chemical opens up the alveoli when they're closed or when they're wet or when they're sticky. So let me say it another way. When we're growing and developing inside of mom, we don't need to breathe. She does the breathing for us. Her oxygen goes into our blood because that's the way it happens. Well, once we start operating our lungs, the water comes out. Now our alveoli have to start expanding and closing. If they close and they're moist, you ever had two little membranes that are wet that stick together? You can't peel them apart hardly. They get stuck. Surfactant takes that and lowers the surface tension on the molecules so it opens real easily. So surfactant is a chemical that helps to keep the alveoli open or lets them open in the first place. That's so important because premature babies don't always make that. They don't make it until a certain point. So one of the things that have helped premature babies do so much better is they figured that out and they can now give them surfactants to open that up. Also, hey, you're breathing in all kinds of bacteria and viruses and things. We might need to keep our lungs clean. So there are macrophages that live in the lungs. They spend their life roaming through the lungs. And they give them their own fancy name. They actually call them dust cells. That might be in the lecture. Certainly it's not in the lab. But macrophages do. There are certain population that live their whole life in your lungs. And they stay there. Okay. Don't know if you remember from AMP1, there's macrophages that spend their whole life in your brain. Those were the cells called microglia, and they are central nervous system white blood cells, basically. So there's a little different view. I would like get a picture just of this side right there with that stuff. The good news is we did almost all of this already. Look, apex, superior lobe, middle lobe, inferior lobe. What's this fissure? And what's this one? Yes. And aha, look, base of the lung. Once again, apex. Oh, trachea. Look at the C rings. Cool. Remember the thymus gland? So this shows us that everything in the middle between the lungs is in that space called the mediastinum that we just did. Mediastinum. What's this little thing where the shark took a bite out of that lung? Cardiac notch. Yeah, cardiac notch. And there, only two lobes over here, superior and what's this fissure? Ta-da! You did it. Okay. Look here, if you can. There's a rib, there's muscles, and there's a lung. So we're going to zoom up on it. Don't worry, I'll save you from it. There we go. Okay. So we have membranes in places where we need to reduce friction. Our guts are in here. We don't want them to stick, so we have membranes on them. We'll talk about those later. The lungs move around in the chest. I mean, not a lot. Our chest moves around them. We don't want that to build up friction. It could build up scar tissue. It could cause pain, restrict your breathing, lots of problems. So the body's so smart. The heart beats, it moves in the chest. They put a membrane around it called a pericardium. Some of it has pericardial fluid, and it slides really. So anyway, the lung membranes are always called the pleura. There's two parts, just like the heart one, except a little different. The membrane on the lung, and let me do this one in blue. I'm going to show it to you right here in blue. The fancy way to say organ, any organ, and this is an old-timey term, is viscera. Organ or viscera. Oh, like Jack the Ripper, when you cut people open, you eviscerate them. You let their organs out. So this membrane is on an organ, so it's visceral, and it's the membrane of the lungs, which are always called pleura. So this layer, or this membrane, is called the visceral pleura. Or you could say visceral layer of the pleura if you want. Just visceral pleura or visceral layer of the pleura. There is a teeny tiny space here with little droplets of fluid. Now I've zoomed up tons, so it makes it look big. It is not big. Those membranes are basically touching in most places with little fluid droplets between them. So they say that, oh, that's technically a cavity. It's a little space there. So they call it the pleural cavity because it's a cavity between the pleura. And then the outside membrane. So where is this? Picture, here's my ribs, right? On the inside of my ribs. On the inside of your rib cage, there's a membrane. So there's a membrane on your body wall on the inside and a membrane on the lung, and they rub like that. Whenever there's a membrane on the body wall or the outside, they use the term parietal. And since it's the lung, pleural. So what I might ask on this is name this membrane or name that membrane or the space between them, okay? Visceral pleura on the lung, parietal pleura on the body cavity, pleural cavity or pleural space, pleural fluid between them. By the way, when's the last time you ate these? Hopefully they were not human. But if you've ever been and seen baby back ribs, look here, here's the rib, here's the pleura. You know how when the ribs curve, one side's shiny, like the top side's not, but you flip them over, no matter what they put on them, that bottom side's still shiny. It's the pleura. It's actually on the ribs. So you've all seen that in real life at some point, whether you eat meat or not, you've seen somebody that had ribs that had that little shiny thing. So that's the pleura. By the way, it's a simple squamous layer. Wow, it's crazy, but it's really tough. So that picture, and then pleura, understanding these membranes is really important. So we're going to do one more picture where I'll show you the pleura. God, we used to have a sheep lung, but I guess when we changed buildings or at some point, somehow it disappeared. The lungs are so spongy because of the alveoli. It's really crazy. Okay, there's a lot on this picture. I'm not giving it to you for the lot. But for fun on your own time, you could look at this and you could go, ooh, there's the aorta. So that's the aortic valve. That's the superior vena cava going into the right atrium. Oh, that must be, oh, that's the heart. That's the right ventricle going to the pulmonary trunk. And there's the pulmonary arteries. That means these must be coming back red. Those are the pulmonary veins coming back to this chamber on the left atrium. Wow, that's cool. There's our primary bronchi right there. There's our esophagus. Yeah, let's not worry about how they did that. Inferior vena cava. They must have cut it. They did something. No, it's not. Anyway, vertebra muscles. They're not really showing your muscles. They got lame and they're drawing there. But finally a lung. And now I'm going to zoom a little for you. And go to one side. So we're really focusing on one side. Hey, look, here's a membrane on the lung. What would we call it? Bing, bing. Visceral pleura. Very good. I cross the gap and look here. Here's a membrane on the body cavity or body wall. What do we call it? Parietal. And it's the lung membrane, so parietal pleura. I don't know if you remember when you did the heart on your own, the lecture part, you had a visceral pericardium and a parietal pericardium. So it was there, okay? It was the same concept. Visceral was on the heart and parietal was separated from it a little bit, okay? And one more thing that's not really testable, but I want you to see because it's true about these membranes and it's really interesting. Look at the visceral layer coming back here. What happens here? It just folds and becomes parietal. It's really one membrane and it folds on itself. And out here it looks like two, but if you take it far enough back, it's really just one membrane that folds. So anyway, this picture would be used for those things right there.